A pilot flying one of those missions later described the flash beneath him as the brightest light he had ever seen in his life. Bright enough to turn the middle of the night into daylight for a fraction of a second, deep inside a mountain most of the world had never heard of until that night. That mountain was Fordow, and what happened? Underneath it didn't just crater some concrete and twist some steel. It set off a chain of events that is still unfolding more than a year later, one that has already produced a second round of strikes, a newly discovered tunnel complex buried even deeper than the first, and a nuclear standoff that nobody involved seems able to actually close out. This is the story of what American bunker busters really did to Iran's underground nuclear program, what they didn't do, and why the tunnels themselves have become the single most important battlefield in the entire confrontation. To understand why this became such a fixation for American and Israeli planners, you have to understand what Fordow actually was before any of this started. It sits near the city of Qom, roughly 100 kilometers south of Tehran, built directly into the side of a mountain, specifically so that its uranium enrichment halls would sit far enough underground to survive exactly the kind of strike that eventually came for it. Iran didn't hide the fact that Fordow existed to be survivable rather than merely functional. The site was revealed publicly. Back in 2009, when Western intelligence agencies confirmed the existence of a secret enrichment facility carved into a mountainside that had been under construction for years, without international inspectors ever knowing it was there. From that point forward, Fordow became the single clearest symbol of Iran's determination to build redundancy into its nuclear program, specifically so that no single strike, no matter how well planned, could end the program outright. For years, Fordow was treated as untouchable, the crown jewel of Iran's ability to keep enriching uranium, no matter what pressure Washington or Jerusalem applied from the outside. Israel had bombed Iranian nuclear infrastructure before, but nothing in its arsenal could reach deep enough to meaningfully touch what sat underneath that mountain. Only one weapon in the world was built with a facility like Fordow specifically in mind: the American GBU-57, a 30,000-pound bunker-buster bomb known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a weapon so large it can only be carried by the B-2 stealth bomber, and one that had never actually been used in combat until the strike that finally came in June of last year. That strike arrived as part of a broader 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and it culminated in an operation the Pentagon named Midnight Hammer, described at the time as the largest B-2 combat mission in American history and the second longest B-2 flight ever conducted. In the early hours of June 22, 2025, American B-2 bombers dropped a dozen of those 30,000-pound bombs on Fordow alone, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, General Dan Kane. He described this sequence publicly afterward. The first pair of bombs blasted through the concrete covering the ventilation shafts that led down into the mountain, and 5 more followed through each opening, entering at speeds faster than 1,100 kilometers an hour before detonating, deep inside what he called the mission space. Alongside the strikes on Fordow, American forces also hit Iran's other major enrichment site at Natanz, which had already sustained earlier damage from Israeli strikes days before, and the Isfahan complex, where cruise missiles struck buildings tied to uranium conversion and the tunnel entrances used to store enriched material. President Trump announced the following morning that the strikes had, in his words, totally obliterated all 3 sites. That declaration turned out to be the beginning of the story, not the end of it, because the actual damage assessment that followed in the weeks and months afterward painted a far more complicated picture than obliterated ever suggested. It's also worth remembering just how much regional and global reaction the strikes triggered in the days immediately afterward, because the fallout wasn't confined to satellite imagery and inspector statements. Force protection levels for American assets across the wider Middle East were elevated in anticipation of Iranian retaliation, and Gulf states with American bases on their territory spent an anxious stretch of days bracing for exactly that kind of response. Oil markets moved sharply on. The news reflecting fears that Iran might attempt to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points for global energy supply anywhere in the world. Russia and China, both of which have maintained varying degrees of diplomatic and economic relationships with Tehran throughout the standoff, condemned the strikes at the United Nations without offering Iran any meaningful military support in response, a pattern that has held largely consistent through every subsequent round of escalation since. That absence of a great power military backer for Iran has arguably shaped this entire conflict as much as any individual weapon involved, because it's left Tehran to absorb repeated strikes on its own soil with essentially no prospect of the kind of external deterrent that might otherwise have made Washington and Jerusalem think twice before returning for a second and third round. According to reporting that emerged from American officials reviewing the strike results, only one of the 3 targeted sites was assessed as genuinely destroyed. Fordow, the facility the Massive Ordnance Penetrator was specifically designed to reach, was assessed to have had its enrichment capability set back by as much as 2 years, a serious blow, but a setback rather than a permanent end. Natanz and Isfahan told a different story entirely. American officials reportedly knew even before the strikes that both sites contained structures and enriched material buried deeper than even the GBU-57 could reach. Indications had existed as far back as 2023 that Iran was already digging new tunnels at Natanz positioned below where American bunker busters could physically penetrate. And Isfahan had its own deep underground tunnel network that the strikes never fully resolved. It's worth understanding just how unusual the Massive Ordnance Penetrator itself is within the American arsenal, because that context explains why so much of this entire standoff has revolved around a single weapon system. The bomb had been in development for close to 2 decades before it was ever used in combat, originally commissioned specifically because American planners recognized that existing bunker buster designs couldn't reach facilities built as deep as Fordow. Because it weighs 30,000 pounds, only the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber can carry it, which is precisely why the mission required stealth bombers flying an extraordinarily long round trip from the continental United States, rather than shorter-range aircraft, operating from bases closer to the region. That scarcity matters for everything that's happened since. There is no larger, more capable version of this weapon currently sitting in reserve, no next model waiting to solve the problem if Pickaxe Mountain turns out to be dug deep enough to survive a strike from the same bomb that damaged Fordow. Whatever comes next in this standoff has to work with the same tool that's already been used once, unless an entirely new weapon system gets developed and fielded, a process that historically takes years rather than months. The International Atomic Energy Agency's own assessment, delivered by Director General Rafael Grossi in the days immediately following the strikes, captured just how much uncertainty remained even for the people whose entire job is verifying what's happening inside Iran's nuclear program. Grossi told the world that Fordow had clearly been directly impacted, but that the actual degree of damage inside the underground enrichment halls could not be determined with certainty, given how deep those halls sat and how the bombs were designed to penetrate before detonating. At Isfahan, he confirmed that tunnel entrances used to store enriched material had been hit, but hitting an entrance and destroying what sits behind it are 2 very different outcomes, and nobody outside Iran's own government could say for certain which one had actually happened. What Grossi could confirm was something almost stranger than the damage itself. Iranian authorities reported no increase in off-site radiation levels following any of the strikes, meaning that whatever happened to the enriched material inside those mountains, it hadn't escaped into the surrounding environment in any way inspectors could detect from outside. Independent researchers tracking the aftermath through satellite imagery picked up exactly where the official assessments left off, and what they documented over the following months tells its own story about how seriously Iran took the threat of a follow-up strike. Within days of the bombing, commercial satellite images showed heavy earth-moving equipment arriving at Fordow, excavators and cranes working near the impact craters left by the bunker busters, and a new access road built connecting the site's tunnel entrance to one of the fresh craters. A weapons expert reviewing the imagery at the time described the activity as consistent with Iran filling in the craters and conducting its own engineering damage assessments alongside radiological sampling, essentially trying to understand from the inside exactly what the American bombs had actually done, information Iran had every incentive to keep to itself. There's an important technical distinction underneath all of this satellite imagery detective work that's worth spelling out plainly, because it explains why nobody outside Iran's government can say with real confidence how badly Fordow was actually hurt. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator is designed to detonate after boring down through rock and concrete, which means the visible evidence left behind on the surface, craters, collapsed shaft openings, scorched earth around the impact points, tells observers relatively little about what actually happened dozens of meters below ground, where the enrichment halls themselves were built. Satellite imagery can show that a bomb entered a shaft. It cannot show what that bomb did to the centrifuge cascades sitting at the bottom of it, whether the blast wave traveled far enough through the tunnel network to destroy equipment in adjacent chambers, or whether sections of the facility far from the impact points came through essentially untouched. That gap between what's visible from orbit and what's actually true underground is exactly why the IAEA's own language stayed so carefully hedged in the aftermath. And it's exactly why American intelligence assessments took months to settle on even a rough estimate of how much time the strikes had actually bought. That activity eventually slowed. By early November, imagery of Fordow showed that the site had gone largely dormant, its damage assessment work apparently wrapped up, the access roads and equipment removed, and the blast holes above the ventilation shafts filled back in, almost as if Iran had finished taking stock of the wound and quietly closed the door on further visible activity, at least at that particular site. The historical parallel worth drawing here comes from North Korea, another country that spent decades building its weapons program underground, specifically to defeat exactly the kind of precision airstrike the United States has now demonstrated against Iran. North Korea's underground facilities, tunneled into mountainous terrain near its border with China, have survived every round of international pressure applied against them precisely because Pyongyang made the same calculation Tehran eventually made. Depth and concrete are cheaper and more reliable than diplomacy when the goal is simply surviving long enough to keep a weapons program alive. Analysts who track proliferation patterns across both countries have noted the same underlying lesson applies in both cases. A determined state with enough time, enough engineering capacity, and enough tolerance for economic isolation can keep digging deeper than any single generation of bunker buster technology can reach, turning what looks like a decisive military victory on the day of the strike into, at best, a temporary delay measured in months or a couple of years, rather than a permanent solution. But dormant at Fordow did not mean dormant everywhere. And this is where the story shifts toward what has actually become the more urgent concern for American and Israeli planners over the past several months. Roughly 2 kilometers south of the Natanz complex sits a mountain known as Ku-e-Kolangazla, more widely referred to now by the nickname Pickaxe Mountain, and it was not part of the target package during the 12-day war at all. Iranian officials have described it publicly as a centrifuge assembly facility that has technically been under construction since 2020, but Western intelligence assessments have grown increasingly convinced it represents something far more significant, a next-generation enrichment site, dug as deep as 100 meters beneath solid granite, specifically engineered from the outset to survive an attack from the exact same massive ordnance penetrator that tore through Fordow. According to satellite imagery reviewed by the Institute for Science and International Security throughout the early months of this year, Iran spent that period actively hardening the tunnel portals at Pickaxe Mountain, pouring concrete over the western entrance and compacting rock and soil over the eastern one, work explicitly aimed at adding the kind of overburden that would make a repeat of the Fordow strike far less effective if it ever came. The scale of what might be sitting inside that mountain is what makes this such a pressing concern, rather than just another data point in a long-running standoff. Before the 12-day war began, Iran had accumulated somewhere in the range of 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, a level just a short technical step below weapons grade, and enough material, according to independent estimates, to potentially fuel somewhere close to 10 separate nuclear devices if further enriched. That stockpile was reportedly dispersed across Fordow, Natanz, and the deep tunnels at Isfahan, rather than concentrated in a single location, a deliberate hedge against exactly the kind of single decisive strike the United States eventually attempted. Grossi has since said publicly that he believes roughly 200 kilograms of that highly enriched material remains stored inside the deep tunnel complex outside Isfahan specifically, material that inspectors have still not been able to physically verify or account for, because access to some of the damaged sites has simply not been granted. Whether any portion of that broader stockpile has since been quietly relocated toward the new fortified site at Pickaxe Mountain is precisely the question keeping American and Israeli intelligence analysts up at night, and it's a question nobody outside Iran's own government has been able to answer with confidence. This uncertainty didn't stay theoretical for long. By late February of this year, tensions had escalated to the point that American forces carried out a fresh round of strikes inside Iran, part of what stretched into roughly 10 straight days of renewed conflict. In the middle of that escalation, President Trump began publicly threatening Pickaxe Mountain by name, telling reporters the United States would be hitting that area, in his words, pretty soon and very heavily. Reporting. At the time, indicated Israeli intelligence assessed that Iran had already transferred centrifuges, the machines used to actually enrich uranium, into the new facility the previous fall, though Trump himself was notably cautious when directly asked about that reporting, saying Iran may have moved equipment there, but stressing that what ultimately mattered to Washington was tracking the material itself rather than the machinery. As he put it, nothing about a hardened tunnel matters unless the enriched uranium is actually sitting inside it. That February round of strikes still didn't touch Pickaxe Mountain directly, and the site kept advancing anyway. In March, a separate and less publicized strike hit a facility called Taligan 2, a bunkered site tied to Iran's historical Ahmad program, the codename for Tehran's earlier, more explicit weapons development efforts. Satellite analysis afterward showed the bunker buster strikes had precisely targeted the length of what researchers assessed to be the facility's main high-explosive test chamber, with clear evidence. The blast had traveled outward from inside the structure rather than simply cratering the surface above it, knocking down a defensive wall near one of the entrances in the process. A separate building nearby, tied to fire control and instrumentation work referenced in Iran's older weapons documentation, was destroyed outright in the same operation. That strike demonstrated something important. American and Israeli forces were no longer only targeting the well-known enrichment halls at Fordow and Natanz. They were now reaching back into Iran's older, more secretive weapons development infrastructure as well, sites tied not to civilian enrichment claims, but to the historical record of actual weapons design, work Tehran has spent years publicly denying ever happened. Through all of this, a diplomatic track was running in parallel, and it's produced results just as murky as the military side of the story. In mid-June, the United States and Iran reached a memorandum of understanding meant to freeze the situation in place, while broader negotiations continued, requiring Iran to maintain the current status of its nuclear program and refrain from further construction at nuclear-related sites for the duration of talks. The problem, according to the same satellite monitoring that's tracked this entire saga from the beginning, is that construction at Pickaxe Mountain never actually stopped. By early July, new imagery showed vehicles and construction crews still actively reinforcing the tunnel entrances at the site, work the Monitoring Institute explicitly described as inconsistent with the terms of the agreement Iran had just signed. And there's a specific reason the site sits in that kind of legal gray zone rather than being an outright violation everyone can point to and act on. Pickaxe Mountain was never formally listed among the nuclear sites the agreement actually covers. Iran has separately closed off 3 specific locations to inspectors entirely, but Pickaxe Mountain isn't among the sites named in that dispute either. It exists in a genuine blind spot, a facility with the specifications and strategic purpose of a major weapons-capable enrichment site, sitting completely outside the boundaries of every framework currently governing what inspectors are allowed to see and what Iran is technically required to stop building. Meanwhile, Iran's broader military infrastructure has been quietly rebuilding on a timeline that should concern anyone assuming last year's strikes permanently degraded the country's underground capabilities. According to defense assessments referenced in recent monitoring reports, Iran has restored access to 50 of the 69 tunnel entrances across 18 separate underground missile facilities damaged during the 12-day war, all since a ceasefire took hold back. In April, damaged access roads leading to those facilities have also been repaired, restoring the logistical movement needed to actually use them again. That's not a country sitting still and absorbing a knockout blow. That's a country running a systematic, well-resourced reconstruction program across dozens of sites simultaneously, treating the strikes less as a permanent defeat and more as a serious but survivable setback to be engineered around, the exact same instinct visible in the deeper, better-hardened design of Pickaxe Mountain itself. That reconstruction effort has run alongside a domestic economic story inside Iran that rarely makes it into coverage, focused purely on the military and diplomatic dimensions of this standoff, but it shapes everything happening underground just as much as any satellite photo does. Years of sanctions, further tightened in the aftermath of Lasto. Years' strikes have squeezed Iran's ability to import the specialized equipment a modern enrichment and tunneling program depends on, forcing much of the reconstruction effort to rely on domestically sourced materials and engineering expertise developed over decades of operating under exactly this kind of economic pressure. That self-reliance cuts 2 ways. It has clearly slowed some aspects of the rebuilding effort, based on how long portions of the missile tunnel network took to reopen even after the ceasefire took hold. But it has also meant Iran isn't dependent on any single foreign supplier, that outside powers could pressure into cutting off support, the same lesson other. Sanctioned states have learned the hard way over the years. A domestic industrial base built specifically to survive isolation is slower to mobilize, but far harder to fully choke off once it's up and running. Diplomatically, the picture has grown only more tangled since the June Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Technical nuclear talks that officials on both sides described as imminent back in the spring, expected to finally hash out exactly what inspection access Iran would grant and which sites would fall under the agreement's protections, had still not formally begun as of the most recent reporting available. That delay matters enormously because every month, those talks don't start, as another month construction continues at Pickaxe Mountain without any binding framework requiring it to stop. In another month, IAEA inspectors remain unable to physically verify where Iran's remaining stockpile of highly enriched uranium is actually being stored. Grossi himself has acknowledged publicly that inspectors have observed movement around the sites where that enriched material is known to be kept, without being able to confirm whether any of it has actually left those locations, a distinction that sounds technical, but carries enormous weight for anyone trying to assess how close Iran might currently be to reconstituting a weapons-capable stockpile in a location nobody outside Tehran can currently monitor. It's worth stepping back here to appreciate the pattern this entire saga has settled into, because it says something important about the actual limits of even the most powerful conventional bunker-buster weapon in the world. A single strike, however devastating, buys time. It does not buy permanent Resolution against an adversary determined enough and resourced enough to simply dig deeper the next time. Fordow was engineered to survive anything short of a purpose-built 30,000-pound penetrator, and it very nearly held even against that. Pickaxe Mountain is now being engineered from the outset to survive that exact weapon too, built under solid granite at depths approaching 100 meters, specifically because Iranian planners watched what happened at Fordow and adjusted their next design around the lesson. One senior regime advisor has reportedly gone so far as to call Pickaxe the most fortified nuclear facility in the world, alongside explicit threats about the consequences of any strike against it. Whether that claim survives contact with an actual American or Israeli attack remains untested, but the confidence behind it reflects a program that has spent the past year treating every previous strike as a design specification for the next facility rather than as a reason to abandon the broader effort. That compounding cycle is really the core of what makes this story so different from a typical single strike and response narrative. Israel struck first, opening cracks in Iran's above-ground infrastructure. The United States followed with the one weapon built specifically to reach underneath it. Iran responded not by surrendering the program, but by digging further down and further away from the reach of everything currently in the American and Israeli arsenal. That response then triggered a second round of American strikes in February, followed by additional targeted hits on older weapons development infrastructure in March, followed by a diplomatic freeze that the satellite evidence suggests Iran has continued working around anyway. Every step in that sequence has been driven by the same underlying logic. Neither side has found a way to permanently resolve the standoff. So each new phase simply escalates the sophistication of both the attack and the defense being built against the next one, a slow-motion arms race, between depth and reach that shows no sign of settling on a final answer anytime soon. There's also a human and political dimension sitting underneath all of this technical back and forth that's easy to lose in the satellite imagery and megaton figures. Iranian opposition figures, including one who first publicly exposed the existence of the Natanz site more than 2 decades ago, have pointed to Tehran's insistence during negotiations on preserving its enrichment capability, even while simultaneously rebuilding damaged facilities, as clear evidence that the country's supreme leader has no genuine intention of abandoning the broader weapons-capable program, regardless of what any interim agreement says on paper. That assessment, coming from someone whose entire public career has been built around exposing the gap between Iran's official statements and its actual nuclear activities, carries particular weight for Western officials trying to decide how much trust to place in the current diplomatic framework. Israel, notably, is not even a party to the current memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran, and its officials have been openly critical of the diplomatic framework, arguing it leaves exactly the kind of gap that a facility like Pickaxe Mountain can slip through. That disagreement between Washington's negotiating track and Israel's assessment of the actual threat has become its own quiet fault line running underneath the entire standoff, one that could determine whether the next move in this sequence comes from renewed diplomacy or from another set of B-2 bombers heading toward a mountain in central Iran. There's a particular kind of strategic patience running through Tehran's approach here that's worth naming directly, because it explains why the diplomatic track keeps moving so much slower than the construction crews at Pickaxe Mountain. Every month spent negotiating over inspection language is a month Iran's engineers spend pouring concrete over tunnel portals that grow more expensive and more time-consuming to eventually breach with each passing week. That asymmetry favors whichever side is willing to let talks drag on the longest, and so far, all the visible evidence points toward Tehran being the party more comfortable with delay, precisely because delay is currently working in its favor on the ground. Washington, meanwhile, faces the opposite incentive. The longer construction continues unchecked, the harder and more costly any eventual strike becomes, which creates pressure to either force the inspection issue quickly through diplomacy or accept that waiting simply hands Iran a stronger, deeper, better defended facility with each passing season. So where does this actually leave things as of right now? The publicly available evidence paints a picture that's neither the totally obliterated victory declared in the immediate aftermath of Midnight Hammer, nor the picture of an untouched, fully intact nuclear program that Iran's own rhetoric sometimes suggests. Fordow took genuine, serious damage, likely setting back its specific enrichment capability by something in the range of a year or two, based on the assessments that have leaked out through American intelligence channels. Natanz and Isfahan sustained real damage to their above-ground and shallow tunnel infrastructure, but both sites had deeper underground elements that the strikes either couldn't fully reach or couldn't be verified as fully destroyed, and a meaningful share of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile remains unaccounted for by international inspectors to this day. And running underneath all of it, quietly and with an urgency that has only grown over the past several months, sits Pickaxe Mountain, A facility purpose-built to make sure that whatever vulnerability doomed Fordow doesn't get repeated, sitting in a legal and diplomatic blind spot that neither the current Memorandum of Understanding nor the IAEA's existing inspection framework fully covers, actively under construction as of the most recent satellite imagery available. What happens next depends almost entirely on a handful of unresolved questions that nobody outside a very small circle of officials in Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran can currently answer with confidence. Has centrifuge equipment and enriched material actually been moved into Pickaxe Mountain in meaningful quantities? Or is the site still, as Iran claims, primarily an assembly facility without the material that would make it an actual production threat? Will the current diplomatic framework eventually expand to formally cover the site, forcing Iran to either open it to inspection or accept the consequences of refusing, or will construction simply continue in the gray zone it currently occupies until someone in Washington decides the risk of waiting outweighs the risk of striking a facility explicitly designed to survive the strike? And perhaps most importantly, if American or Israeli forces do eventually move against Pickaxe Mountain the way they moved against Fordow, does the far greater depth and hardening of the new site hold up better than Fordow's did? Or does it simply become the next entry in a satellite imagery record showing craters, damage assessments, and construction crews quietly returning to dig even deeper the second time around? None of those questions have clean answers right now, and that uncertainty is precisely why this story hasn't actually ended. More than a year after the brightest light one pilot had ever seen lit up the sky above a mountain outside Qom. The tunnels didn't just survive that night. In important ways, they adapted. And the program they were built to protect is still finding new ground to dig into every time the ground above it gets taken away.